My name is Judge Jim Gray, and we are here on our series, Becoming America. America is a perfect idea. The United States of America is a work in progress. And it's here to discuss the Constitutional Convention of 1787, as well as the values. We try to make it as accurate as we can, but I am here to keep these things accurate with our good friend and co-host, Dr. Joellen Chatham, who we logically call the professor, and the Honorable Bijan Kian, who we logically call the American for reasons that we will discuss. And my name again is Judge Jim Gray. They call me on occasion the judge. But this is the 10th in our series. We're proud of this series. We bring in really talented and knowledgeable people as our guests, as you have seen. You can go back and watch any of these. In fact, as far as the music is concerned, you can go to judgejimgray.com and see any of the music. This is the 10th of our series, and the song is entitled My Country Needs Me. And you'll find that there's deep irony here because My Country Needs Me with Thomas Jefferson, who, by the way, was our ambassador to France at the time. He wasn't there, but his spirit certainly was. But he's talking about slow government, small government, limited government. In fact, he says, trust our power to the plain folk. They can and will stand tall. Check and balance power given and keep the government small. My country needs me. And then totally on the other hand was Alexander Hamilton, who had his followers as well. And he's saying things like, government should have every power that it needs to fully exercise its deeds. So my country needs me. We need a strong government. We need a standing army. So that's where we are in this irony, because that's what was fought out in the Constitutional Convention. We'll discuss it a little bit further with our guests. But in the meantime, let's hear the song, My Country Needs Me.
My country needs me. My country needs me. My country needs me. Needs me. How we do and where we go, what change goes through, fast or slow, so many paths to trod, but still I know my country needs me. What powers to give and still be free, or might we lose our liberty? All is not clear for sure, but this I see, my country needs me. Trust our power to the plain folk. They can and will stand tall. Check and balance powers given and keep the government small. Government should surely have every power that it needs to fully care for all its people and execute its deeds.
When times are hard and things get rough, when met with scorn and much rebuff, when most men say they've had enough, my country needs me.
So
I, my country,
where we go,
my country,
what change goes through, fast or slow, so many plans, but this I know, my country needs me.
so light the flame and stir the passions once again for what we share. A strong hand is what is needed to make strong from what now is weak. How they dare, how they dare, oh, how they dare.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. Cato Institute is a think tank in the parlance, a 501c3 educational institution that is focusing on limited government, peace, individual liberty, what could generally be called libertarianism. It's a fairly large organization. We cover everything. We're a full service public policy shop, constitutional law, criminal justice, trade, economic policy, foreign policy, you name it.
And it keeps you busy studying the Constitution.
Absolutely, yes. And it's always a challenge protecting the Constitution.
And Bijan, I think you have the first question.
I'll be happy to do that. And thank you so much for joining us today, Trevor. We hear that the issues at the convention were many, but a particular point of argument was that the Articles of Confederation gave equal rights to the states, but some states claimed that because of their population, they were entitled to a larger representation in the national legislature. How was this issue resolved? Who led the discussion on this? And we're all interested, and I'm sure our viewers are interested to know, who was the champion on this issue that had this result finally?
Well, it's interesting to think about the context of the Articles of Confederation. So we've had since the war, we've had an Articles of Confederation that could be thought of as something more akin to a treaty than a unified government. Now, if you think about treaties, you think about, say, the UN treaty or the EU treaty, and you think about Germany and Netherlands. So in the UN, Germany has one representative, even though they have about 80 million people, and Netherlands has one representative, even though they have about 20 million people. They represent the states, qua the states. They represent the interests of the states as a whole, and they do not vary by population. And they get together and they discuss what's going to happen to the state. Similarly speaking, when treaty organizations get together, most of the things that they do are not self-executing, which is to say that if the United States ambassador to the UN, who represents the 330 million people of the United States, enters into agreement at the UN that says, hey, we're going to prosecute drug crimes more, for example, or a convention like the Hague Convention of 1912, that doesn't immediately become effective inside of the state. What a government based on treaty is unable to do is what I would call pierce the veil of the sovereignty of the individual states, unless those states pass laws that enact those. That is essentially what the Articles of Confederation did. It had very little ability to act on the people of the states, and so all the states were equally represented. They could choose delegations up to 7, so you could have 7 delegates, for example, or just 1, and they would negotiate things in a treaty type of manner. Well, there were a lot of people, James Madison being the most prominent, who thought that this was not only an effective form of government, but illegitimate in the sense that popular sovereignty was the source of governmental legitimacy, which we know from our John Locke and even to some extent Rousseau. So the fact that the people were not directly represented by the Articles of Confederation, it emasculated the power of the Articles of Confederation, and most importantly, it made it illegitimate for the government of the Articles to act on the people in, say, taxation. Like James Madison would have never been for the Articles of Confederation government taxing the people directly, because the government of the Articles had to get money just like the UN. How does the UN get money? It asked for it. And if we decide not to give them money, it can't do anything to take money from the individual people. And if the UN decided to tax us as American citizens directly, what would we say? We would say no taxation without representation. We would say that the UN is not allowed to tax us because we are not directly represented in the UN. So this is the backdrop of the war, the Revolutionary War, and then trying to change the article. So the first thing James Madison thought was we need direct representation of some sort under a popular representation system in order to legitimize the type of government that he envisioned, which would have more power to it than the articles would have because of the bottom line there. That's the most important point. So what James Madison thought was sort of filtering mechanism. He had deep suspicions about the people, but believed in popular representation. So his filtering mechanism would essentially be something like a popular house elected by the people, which would then choose something like a Senate, which would then choose something like an executive of this entire tier resting on the popular sovereignty of the people. Now, of course, James Madison was from Virginia, which was a populous state. And if you were from Delaware, which only had about 100,000 people at the time, you had some problems with this. In fact, the convention delegates from Delaware were told that one thing that they were not allowed to do was to alter in any way the equal representation system of the Articles of Federation. They were given that command. So that was one thing that, say, John Dickinson had to be overcome in dealing with it. George Reed had to be dealing with Delaware. So that's the fight. The fight is between the people who earnestly believe the popular representation is not just more just, it's not more, it creates a better system of government, but it's a more just system of government. And those who do not want to lose the power of their states and also believe that there's a reason that states should act qua states and not just popular representation.
Well, and it turned out to be a balance, but I can tell you, Mr. Burrus, that I don't think taxation with representation is really all that wonderful either. But there was a huge reaction, and this is the way I, in my maybe sometimes unschooled way, see it, that they just rebelled from King George III, and he was a tyrant. You know, he would say this and that'd take care of that. So they overreacted and they went to the Articles of Confederation, which just gave no power to anybody except the states. And so it just wasn't working. So, you know, they couldn't tax, they couldn't pay their debts, they couldn't negotiate treaties because even some of the states were starting to negotiate treaties themselves. So they had this, and there are many people that did want to overthrow the government, James Madison included. So it came about, what are we going to have? Are we going to have another king? How strong should the executive be? And that was a major source of difficulty. Are you going to have a panel of people that will make, in fact, the executive? How did that dialogue go, Trevor?
Oh, well, the executive power, that's the most sort of drawn out and contentious and sort of bizarre discussion through the course. But I want to go back to your point, Judge Gray, about initially, right? So the problem with the articles was the first one was money and that executive action. So it's Shays Rebellion and the inability to counter Shays Rebellion in Massachusetts, which was a sort of farmers versus East Coast elites rebellion. We also had the inability to raise money. And what we had seen in the middle 1780s is we'd seen two provisions for taxes, mainly tariffs, not taxes on individual people, struck down by individual states because it was unanimous required. So what we had New York strike one down because New York wanted all of the revenue. They wanted the goods to come in New York and be shipped to other states and to put their tariffs on it, not have national tariffs. And of course, Rhode Island, which was known as Rogue Island at the time, they were striking down everything all the time. So that's the first question in the Convention of Annapolis in 1786, which was adopted that didn't bark. Only 14 people showed up. That's when they called the May Convention with the idea of fixing the exigencies of what was necessary to fix the exigencies of the Union. The executive, though, they really start talking about that in early June, on June 1st, actually, but the first day of the convention is May 25th. The first thing that they want is the legislature. There's a reason that Article 1 covers Congress. The legislature was the most important branch to nearly everyone there. What they were disagreeing about with the executive was they didn't want a King George, as you pointed out. They did not want anything like that. They had seen the tyranny. And what you had seen in the states between, say, roughly 1776, is all these states had to rewrite their royal charters. Right, so there was the biggest era of constitution making at that point in world history was actually between 1776 and 1787, because all these states had to write their constitutions, which were extremely influential by the time they get to the convention in 1787. But the problem here was that many of those states had gone wildly populist. The best example of this would be Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania had chosen, essentially, there was no executive. They were so afraid of King George type of implications that there was no executive. There was a unicameral legislature with massive popular representation that produced what many people, especially James Wilson, which was his home state, what they thought was a non-functioning government. So James Wilson was actually the one who came in first to say that we need something that most resembles something like the executive branch today. Some ability to act when the crisis comes, some ability to act in foreign affairs and execute the laws of the nation.
The Articles of Confederation were deficient, as you've said, in many ways. They didn't have legislative authority of any extent. There's really no executive to carry out any laws that such a legislature might create. So they began to create a national government that had some real authority. But one of the biggest issues with all of the states was how much authority should that national government have. The states were used to having authority under their own new constitutions. They began to develop that authority even under King George. But what was the contest between this new national government and the fear that it would override the states? How was that worked out?
I mean, you could say we're still working it out to this day, but the idea at the time. So what the convention delegates did is that they first put forth two basic plans, as we probably discussed on other episodes of this. They put forth the Virginia plan, which was James Madison's mostly, and then in contrary to that, which was a much more small state and equal state representation plan presented by William Patterson of New Jersey. Now the South had got together on that, such as Charles Pinckney from South Carolina. What you had seen, though, was at first the question was, how is the legislature going to be constituted? Well, we already discussed, is it going to be popular or is there going to be state representation? Then they passed resolutions that said, we will empower the legislator, what they would call the general legislator of the time, the national legislator, to legislate in all cases where the states were sort of individually incapable. But of course, that doesn't fill in the blanks. Like, what are all the cases where the states are individually incapable of acting together? And so they later, and a lot of this came out in the committee of detail, went through and listed powers. Some of them were not very controversial. Some of them, like issuing letters of marque of reprisal. So that would be a foreign affairs power. A letter of marque of reprisal, by the way, is essentially a way of creating a militia, a naval militia. You can authorize someone who owns a private boat to essentially fight your wars for you. This is often how pirates were created, by the way. But you had all these different things about the ability to tax, excise taxes. There was no income tax at the time. The ability to coin money, not print money, by the way, to coin money. The ability to punish laws against crimes against the laws of nations, such as piracy. And other clauses that said the ability to sort of regulate interstate commerce, which no one debated at the time and would later arguably swallow the entire enumeration of those powers. And in your question, Joellen, that the issue is mostly kind of, if you look at your Constitution, I have the Cato Pocket Constitution here, which I carry everywhere. The most important words in the Constitution, arguably, on this question of how we're going to, yes, Judge Gray has one too, how we're going to figure out what powers the national legislature has, is actually in Article 1, Clause 1, the very first lines after the preamble, which are all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. The most important words in that sentence are herein granted. Because if you took out those words and it just said all legislative power shall be vested in a Congress, then it would be telling us that there's a thing called the legislative power, which in the common law Anglo tradition would be basically everything that is capable of being legislated on. And that would be put into the Congress. That would basically tell us that the Congress would have no limits. It would essentially be something like one of the state governments, the original sovereigns. But instead, they said just the powers that are granted, and there are only 18 of them. And then a clause that says that they can kind of stretch those if they need to.
So those powers are found really in Article 1, Section 8. They're listed. You can read them. Anyone can read them. But at the bottom of that list, it says that in addition to these enumerated powers, Congress has the power to do all that is necessary and proper to carry into effect those foregoing powers. Now, that did become very controversial during the ratification debates, because what was necessary and who would decide what was necessary or what was proper? talk a little bit about the necessary and proper clause and how that has played out.
It's a fascinating debate, and some of the most sort of trenchant observations of the Anti-Federalists came on the subject of the necessary and proper clause. Going back to the sort of the idea here, what we're talking about, overthrow. Remember that there was a government of the United States when the convention met. There were people who were very concerned about their states and whether or not any proposed government would be so powerful that it would essentially not only overthrow, be a coup against the Articles government, but essentially eviscerate the powers of the state governments via creative construction of, say, the necessary and proper clause. As I said, no one mentioned the Commerce Clause. They were very concerned with the taxing power. They thought you could use the taxing power to essentially destroy the state governments. And then you have people like Brutus, who was probably Robert Yates, who was a member of who attended the convention up until about July 10th as part of the New York delegation. But he was a George Clinton man, which meant he was an anti-federalist. He left the convention in disgust after he realized that they'd essentially voted to throw the entire Articles out and create a new government that was going to be very powerful. So Robert Yates came in October, mid-October of 1787, 1 month after the Constitution is signed on September 17th. And he writes an essay about what's wrong with the general government and the plan that is proposed. And one of the things he points out is that there is a clause, the necessary and proper clause, that says, as you pointed out, not only you can take a power like the power to establish post roads, that's another power of the federal government listed in the Constitution of the Congress. And at the very end, it says it is the power to do all things necessary and proper to carry into execution the foregoing powers. Now, if you combine a power like the power over post roads and that clause, you say the government has the power to establish post roads and to do all things necessary and proper to establishing post roads. Well, what could that entail? That could entail possibly a lot of things. And how are we going to define necessary and proper? One of Brutus's most sort of astute observations, especially when we look at what's happening today, is that they would never sort of stop claiming that something was necessary, because something that was not in their dominion would throw a wrench in the gears. And he has this great line which says that has been the path of all governments, to continue to claim that something was necessary until they have dominion over all things. And so this was a huge concern, and Alexander Hamilton comes in and James Madison come and say, no, this is not an augmenting clause. It's a limiting clause. It does nothing more than what is implied by the entire thing. Just when you say you have the ability to establish post roads, it's at least implied that you have the ability to do things that you need to do to establish post roads. So it's no more than that. And they try to assuage the fears in the Federalist Papers. And arguably those fears were properly assuaged. They did not manifest in the same way. We could talk about the National Bank. They did not manifest in the same way until the 20th century. And now the necessary and proper clause is used to tie powers through multiple connections to the smallest little object of regulation.
Well, it's just outcome oriented. It's basically if this is what you want, then it's necessary and proper. If it's what you don't want, then it's not. Surprise, surprise.
So, Trevor, I read that towards the end, as the convention was coming to a close, George Mason insisted that there must be a Bill of Rights. And in fact, he refused to sign the Constitution because it did not include the Bill of Rights. Alexander Hamilton, on the other hand, was of the belief that the Bill of Rights was unnecessary. And what I find interesting is the word liability. We hear that he said it actually can be a liability. Why did he say that? What liability did he have in mind as it came to Bill of Rights? And how did this issue get resolved?
It is fascinating, isn't it? You ask, if you went to, I'm using Walmart here as just an American place where people go, normal Americans. I mean, I go to Walmart. If you went to a Walmart and you just tap someone on the shoulder and said, what's the first thing you know about the Constitution? They're probably going to say the Bill of Rights, or maybe the First Amendment. Maybe they can't tell you what's in it, but that will probably be what they say. And then, you've learned that not only was the Bill of Rights, and this was proposed on September 10th, so near the last week, right? So September 15th is when they kind of finalize it, and then the drafting, the actual writing it down, which, by the way, here's your trivia question for the day. The man whose actual handwriting is on the document that you see in the National Archives is a man named Jacob Shallis, who was the engrosser for the Pennsylvania State House, this place where we all are. He got A's in penmanship class his whole life, so that was his job, was to write official documents. We didn't discover that until the 30s, actually, when we found the little receipt. We got paid $35 for it. Anyway, so on the 10th, it was proposed that we need a Bill of Rights by George Mason. And a few things to remember here. They thought that they had created a government that was limited. It was so limited to these 18 powers that there was no need. There was absolutely no need. The Bill of Rights was in the structure. They also believed that a Bill of Rights would be weirdly dangerous. So they came in with a theory of government, right? So first of all, their main governments are their state governments. They're creating a national government to do a few things that they think the states can't do together. Right? If it's just that, do we really need individual rights against that national government? Right? The analogy here would be the EU, right? So your main government, if you're German or French, is your French or German government. They got a Bill of Rights that protects them against most things. The EU is allowed to do these things. Do you need a Bill of Rights against the EU? Now, the EU is a bad analogy because it was invested with more power from the beginning than the federal government had for many, many decades. And then the other idea would be that they were creating, by enumerating these powers, they were creating what my friend and senior fellow at the Cato Institute, Randy Barnett, Georgetown professor, has described as their idea was that this would be a sea, islands of power and a sea of liberty. So the islands of power were the little powers that Congress has over post roads and coining money and interstate commerce and militia and war. Like those are the islands of power. The rest is liberty. Right? If you propose a different way of going about a constitution, let's call it the French way, which would be what the French did in 1789, a couple of years later, which was to start with rights and as opposed to start with power, and to say, rather than telling you what the government is allowed to do, presuming liberty, we're going to list all the rights that we have. And that implies that everything not listed is given to the government, as opposed to everything that is not given is retained. So that was their first. So in that context, if you think about it, it's not that crazy. They thought that the state governments would be the ones you need a Bill of Rights against. They also didn't really know how it'd be enforced. The idea of suing your state in federal court was really strange at the time for violating your rights. It would have only applied to actions of the Congress. So that's one new thing you see. You see this in the North Carolina ratifying convention. James Iredell, who later became a justice on the Supreme Court, gives this famous speech where he says, give me 20 rights, I'll tell you 20 more. You know, if you keep listing rights, if you keep saying you have a right to wear a red hat, you have a right to wear a green hat, you have a right to wake up on the right side of the bed. Well, does that imply you can't wake up on the left side of the bed? You have the right to, all these things, to part your hair on the right side, but you can't part your hair on the left side. Like the longer it gets, the more that people will read into it that they took all this time to list 1,370 rights. That must mean that the other things are not protected. And moreover, if you listed something like, say, the right to freedom of speech or freedom of the press in the First Amendment, as it is in the First Amendment, or eventually became after Madison's draft, and it went through by the House and the Senate. If you listed that, it would kind of imply that Congress has the power over the press. Like the way they had listed this out, it says there is no need to tell us that Congress does not have power over this thing that they were never given in the first place. If Congress has no power over the press, so why do we need freedom of the press? This is the best type of freedom. It's not given to you, it's retained. It's your natural right. And we give this power to the government, and we never gave them the power to regulate the press. So we don't need to retain, written down, the freedom of the press. Well, I mean, as we know, the ratification process was much more laborious than people understand. It really did get ratified by a hair's breadth. And eventually, the Anti-Federalists started pushing for at least one thing. One of the problems the Anti-Federalists had was organization. There were a lot of them. We don't know who many of them still were. Many of them were not terribly learned, as you might say. It was an urban versus rural thing to a large extent. And they didn't have a cohesive proposal of what they would want to do instead. Some of them would say, we want to go back and have another convention, or we will ratify with amendments, or we'll throw the whole thing out. It's no good from the beginning. So in politics, we know this, like if you get around a proposal, it's like when Obamacare was being debated. They had Obamacare and the detractors had nothing in return. They just had not Obamacare. So that was a problem the Anti-Federalists had, but they finally started coalescing around the need for a Bill of Rights. And eventually, in the New York Convention, it got hairy enough that Madison essentially agreed that part of a concession, that he would draft a Bill of Rights in the first sessions of Congress to protect those rights, the most important ones, I guess. It would be one way of looking at it, even though the Ninth Amendment says that we shouldn't look at it that way.
So one of the defenses against a Bill of Rights was that they were establishing a limited government with limited powers. That's what they assumed. That's what they not only assumed, that's what they wanted, but also they felt comfortable they had built in sufficient checks and balances so that no branch of government could get out ahead of another, that there would be limited. Could you explain what some of those checks and balances were that were to give this confidence the government would be limited?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we have the three branches of government. We have legislative, executive, and judicial in that order, Article 1, Article 2, Article 3. And mostly you're looking at the checks and balances between Article 1, legislator, and Article 2 of the executive. So you have various interplays where sometimes one branch can do something by itself, and sometimes it's dependent upon other branches. So a good example of this, when these were large contentious debates in the convention. Again, the hardest part about thinking about the convention is to, imagine you don't have this government and you're trying to think, would this be a good idea, right? It's like, I think today, like a lot of questions we have today, if we could go back and talk about this in the abstract, like, would it be a good idea to have the president, be able to appoint ambassadors without Senate consent? Well, what would be the problems with that? Well, we want the president and the Senate to be separate, and we want them to be too dependent upon each other. But we don't want the president to just be able to maybe give away positions to his friends without any or qualifications, right? Even though ambassadors basically are that, let's be honest. But aside from other cabinet ministers and things like this, we don't want to just give things away. And the Senate, remember the original Senate, we didn't get to the Great Compromise. The original Senate was, until the 17th Amendment, chosen by the states. Mm-hmm. Going back to my analogy, the state legislators. Going back to my analogy at the beginning about Articles of Confederation being sort of considered like a treaty, well, the eventual compromise, what's called the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise, pushed by Roger Sherman and Oliver Ellsworth from Connecticut, was that we would have one house that did equal representation, and the state legislators would choose two members of the Senate, and we had one house that did popular representation. That's the way it was. And so that Senate was considered to be a little bit wiser, have 6-year terms. And so the Senate, so then we're in the convention. Should we have the president consult with the advice and consent of the Senate, his appointments, or should it be the House? Well, the Senate seems a little bit wiser. There'll be a good check on the nepotism and unqualified people that might arise. Remember, the framers use the word corruption a lot, and they admit that in about 20 different ways. You have kind of contextualize every one of them. Just the fear of powerful men using office for their gain, that was absolutely prominent throughout the convention. And so there's all these things that keep that from happening, and you check one branch against another one. So we have numerous. So just, the most basic check and balance is the veto power and presentment. So you have to have the bills have to start with, be passed by both houses, and then goes to the president for signing or for veto, and then it can be overridden if it goes back. That's a basic. So no one can actually just create laws by themselves, and actually you need two parts of one branch and one other branch to make those laws. The judiciary is not involved in this at all. These are throughout, but it's a debatable issue of how much judiciary was meant to be a check, and what their view of judicial review was. I happen to think that their view of judicial review was pretty robust. That the judiciary would be empowered to strike down laws as unconstitutional. That's what Alexander Hamilton endorses in Federalist 78, and there's some dispute about this, and of course was established in Marbury versus Madison. But that's the ultimate check, is the judiciary, which that Article 3 is the shortest article. It says that the court can hear cases in controversy. It doesn't even set up other federal courts. It just sets up a Supreme Court. Doesn't even tell us how many members of the Supreme Court there are, and it says some things about the jurisdiction, and that's about it. So, but at the end of the day, the judiciary is an important check too.
Well, the judiciary, and we all know, has a check and balance, that because it's in theory, they could be the strongest realm of government because they're the ones that say this law is constitutional or not, and you can't do anything about that. But judiciary cannot bring issues to itself. So that's something. They can't reach out and bring things in. They also have no army. They have no police force. So they have to be somewhat reasonable or it just won't be enforced. But I have a very provocative question for you, Mr. Burrus. We're all here sitting in Independence Hall, the old State House in Philadelphia. I'm wondering if the three of us were there before it was painted or after it was painted, or whether you were, because yours was painted darker. But I guess I'll leave that for the history. But
well, I'll tell you interesting one of the interesting about this room. Just I mean, we kind of know some things. The only really original thing in this room is this chair. Is Washington's chair.
Mm-hmm.
There were green coverings on this, and if you come over here, so they sat in state delegations, right? So they voted by state delegation. It's an important point. They vote so the 7 delegates from Virginia would vote together, and Virginia, and the question, would Virginia vote on this? It'd be 4-3, then yes. And on that, so I meant to on the Bill of Rights, you can say the Bill of Rights motion was unanimously defeated, meaning every state delegation that were there. At that time, there were only 10. New York had lost its delegation, for example, because Alexander Hamilton was the only one there at that time.
Rhode Island never showed up.
And Rhode Island never showed up. And different people came in and out. But there were delegates that voted for a Bill of Rights, but just as a collective state, all the states individually. So over here is Virginia. Say Washington set up there. Sitting over here, Secretary of the Convention William Jackson, who didn't do a very good job. It gives you a general idea of what the layout is here.
Well, in my research for Convention, the Birth of America, it overwhelmed me to see that, yes, we had 55 delegates to the convention, and they bickered, they argued, they debated about virtually everything except, and this is what my research shows, I'll ask you if you agree, that each of the 55 believed that the most important function of government was protecting our liberties from the encroachment of government. All 55 believed that. Number 2 thing of most importance was keeping us safe. So I think we've kind of gotten away from that. And I tend to feel that the delegates would look very askance at us in our country now of having allowed the government to encroach upon our liberties. You're from the Cato Institute, so I probably don't have to convince you of that. But first of all, is my research correct? And secondly, what's your analysis?
I'm going to have to respectfully disagree because we have to go back to the framing of the question. We're talking about a significant number of delegates who owned human beings, first of all, but what they were debating at the time, I mean, they were Lockean and they believed in liberty to some extent, but we can't leave the slavery question aside. But what they were debating would be the powers that this government, this general government, this national government would have. And there was interest in it having powers that were conducive to liberty. But the state governments could be quite oppressive. And many of the people would have been fairly okay with laws that would be very unlibertarian, right, coming from the state government. Right, so they would absolutely have said, okay, drug prohibition or various laws about vices and crimes or all these kind of things. They would have been totally okay with that coming from their state governments. Roger Sherman was a good example. I mean, he was 61 at the convention, fairly conservative man, longtime member of the Connecticut State Legislature, and voted for many extremely conservative laws coming from the Connecticut legislature. But that's the Connecticut legislature. It's allowed to do those things, right? It's allowed to encroach on their liberties more than this national government. So I think you're right. They were animated by Lockean, Anglo-American common law principles that did look at liberty as an important role of government, but they would have voted for many laws that would have been absolutely against liberty in any conception if they came from their state governments.
So Trevor, I have a question. Whenever the question comes up, did they overthrow the United States government? We kind of not sure. There's a preference to stay on the side of, well, it wasn't really an overthrow of the government and so forth. But you're a scholar on this subject. If someone asked you the question that required a yes or no, first of all, is that a reasonable request to have a yes or no answer on such a thing? And what would your answer be?
You mean what I would have voted to ratify the Constitution? No, and I'll tell you why. Hopefully, the press. This is a complex situation. So I don't think under aside from the anarchist sort of proviso and whether or not any government is legitimate, if we have a Lockean theory of government by consent, contractual, some sort of social contract government, one of the things that the Constitution had to do is it did go through the articles, like I said, the Confederation government, right? And it was given to the Confederation government, which then, that's page 5 of the Constitution that said that the states could call these conventions. But here's 2 important points. Basically, that the Constitution could override the previous Articles of Confederation if it was ratified in popular conventions and basically went, depending on your metaphor, under, meaning more fundamental, or above, meaning higher power, higher law, the ratification of the articles. So the Constitution was ratified by popular conventions, not by existing state legislators. And that was seen as essentially removing any stain, right? So when it came out of Independence Hall on September 17, 1787, it was just a piece of paper, right? It had to go through this process to mean anything whatsoever. Now, what I voted for? I would have thought, I believe that there was a rush going on, and there was a lot of chicanery that happened and not a lot of people talk about. For example, so the Pennsylvania State House, that's what this thing is, right? The Pennsylvania State Legislature, which, as I mentioned, was the sort of wildly populist state legislature with these 2 sides. You had the rural Pennsylvanians, which of course rural meant 25 miles outside of Philadelphia. And then you had Philadelphia, the East Coast elites, right? And you had the rubes and you had the elites. And the rubes were going to be more anti-federalists against this Constitution, and the elites were going to be more for it. So you had a legislature that was pretty evenly split between the anti-federalists and the federalists. And there was a desire by the Pennsylvania, so they're saying this was written in our house. We should be the first state to ratify this. We can ratify this immediately. So this is September 25th, 1787. This is a week after they get the actual document. And so they start doing, the anti-federalists, the hinterlands representatives start saying, we want to send copies of the Constitution to our delegates. I mean, just to read. We don't need to be hasty here. Like, do we read the dang thing and see what we should do? And there are some accounts that actually Federalist, what would be Federalist sort of post office people and mail people actually intercepted those shipments, so they couldn't be read, which then made the anti-federalist members of the Pennsylvania State House very upset. So they did what Wisconsin legislators did a few years back during the whole Scott Walker Union thing. They just didn't show up to deny them a quorum. And you needed a quorum of 17 to actually make any vote in the Pennsylvania State Legislature. So none of them showed up. They only had 15 people there. So the next thing that the Federalists did is they sent the sergeant at arms out into the streets of Philadelphia to look for any member of this state house who they could drag into the state house, which they did. They were hiding behind some bookcases. They kicked down the door, picked up these 2 guys, dragged them into the state house, held them into their chair so that they would have 17, and then voted to have a ratifying convention. Egg on their face, Delaware beat them to it because it was just across the river. But that's the kind of stuff that was really making people mad. And it was written about in papers all over the country. This is what they will do to try and get this thing going, right? And as opposed to sitting back and having a conversation about, okay, this is a good plan. This is maybe something we can work off of. And I understand all the problems with that. There was this huge rush to go forward with this. And as Joellen pointed out, the anti-federalists were right about a bunch of things. They were wrong about a bunch of things too, but they were right about a bunch of things. And so I understand the politicking of the Federalists. Oh, also the Federalists controlled the press. Kind of, you can make an analogy maybe to what conservatives think about social media today. But like, only of the 100 newspapers in the country, only about 7 printed anti-Federalist essays at all. And so you had all this stuff that would have made me mad. Even aside from what I thought of the document, I'd be like, what are you guys doing? Like, you say you want to have an open debate and you obviously don't. Right. And there are huge problems with this document. I mean, I would say the necessary proper clause would be a big problem for me, just like the anti-federalists. So yeah, I would have been like, I agree, we need a taxing power, but do we need to go from basically 0 to 100? Is there something in between we could compromise on?
Well, with Pennsylvania, when they brought those 2 guys into the chamber, people in the galleries were yelling, "Lock the doors," because they wanted to leave. And even the parliamentarian was asked, "Can we legally hold them here?" And the parliamentarian read the rules and said, "Well, we can fine them." And so one of the 2 men threw the fine on the table and said, "Let me out." But what happened in Pennsylvania is exactly what you said, Trevor. It was a rush through, it was some heavy-handed tactics. And then you had Georgia, several other states ratified. But when it got to Massachusetts, it was very different. Massachusetts had a huge delegation, 370 some people were elected. And generally, there were 330 delegates that showed up every day. They met for several weeks, but they literally went through the Constitution, paragraph by paragraph. And even the pro-constitutional delegates, such as Francis Dana, in other words, made sure that the anti-federalists could speak. It was very different than what happened in the Pennsylvania. And Massachusetts was critical, because if Massachusetts voted no, then the remaining states, such as South Carolina, Virginia, New York, they would have collapsed as well. And I think the anti-federalists, when I read the convention and the ratifying convention debates, it's clear that the Federalists were looking for stability because they had seen Shays' Rebellion. They knew that the country was falling apart. We couldn't conduct foreign relations because the other countries didn't know who they were dealing with. They really wanted stability. But the common people, the people who sit in the hinterlands, they really wanted their liberty because some of the state governments were high-handed and they wanted their liberty, and they were afraid to give more government more power. But the anti-federalists, again, the people who lost out, if it wasn't for them, we would not have a Bill of Rights. And Trevor, can you talk a little bit about, we talk about what the anti-federalists were against. They were against the Constitution, but they were also for things. What were the anti-federalists for?
What were they for? It's an interesting question because again, it's a hodgepodge group. They were for localism. They were for a bigger hand of the people in the government. They were very against elites. They were against bankers. These are generalizations. Like they were suspicious of powerful people getting together to try and design these governments around them. And what you had seen, I said, in this divide, like this urban-rural divide, which you could say exists today, it actually pervades American history, right? So Shays' Rebellion is a rebellion beginning, around Amherst, right? Like, so going into Western Massachusetts, which is a very different place than the Boston area, right? And what they were for was, like people like Daniel Shays and the people of that rebellion would have been for, like, that came out of a currency problem and what you could pay your debts in, but they were for, someone like him would be for, kind of salt of the earth farmers who had the ability to earn a living and not be encroached upon by the sort of elites out of Boston who wanted to manipulate the banking system for themselves. Those kind of conspiratorial theories by the anti-federalists pervade the debates, right? So, and what you have in, they were for limited government, they were for liberty. But I said, not all anti-federalists you could say are like libertarians or even classical liberals. It's where their government's going to come from, right? If they're going to have localism be their local Amherst government, they might be for wildly unlibertarian laws coming from that, but they just don't want it coming from Boston, and they sure as hell don't want it coming from Washington, D.C., or at that time they had no idea where the capital would be, from 10 miles square governed by a federal enclave, right? They do not want that, right? That just for the same reason as the revolution originally, right? This distant general government that they had barely had a say in was going to be controlled by Virginia and New York and Pennsylvania. And if you were just sort of the common man living in these areas, then you were going to be, not going to enjoy that government and that the freedoms of self-governance, because these people keep trying to make it bigger and bigger and bigger. So I sometimes say that, there's always been this fear of the elites and how they're going to create a bigger government to sort of bring more and more things into their ambit. And to use someone like Alex Jones, or some sort of person like that who says the UN is setting up FEMA camps, that their UN is going to take over power, right? That's a theme that would have been, except for the craziness of Alex Jones, these people who say, oh, the left wants to give more and more power to the UN, having more and more elites control our lives and letting the common man and the American people who don't have our interests in heart, like that kind of concern would have been very, very cognizable to an anti-federalist, just like on a slightly smaller scale. But if you look at travel times, it's about the same amount of scale, right? If you lived 100 miles from Philadelphia, you might as well be living on the moon. I mean, not necessarily, but you'd be living very, very far away. So that's, I think, the best way of thinking what they're for. They're for localism and representative government as they considered it.
Trevor, we're not just jumping with time, and the time flies by, and thank you for all of this, but there's something this obviously is not scripted either. So let me try something out on you, because I have convinced myself of this. Back when we had our first Congress, they had the members of the House of Representatives, and each one represented something in the order of 30,000 constituents. I believe that way, you would be a lot closer to democracy, a lot closer to liberal, and a lot closer with your finger on the pulse. I think we should go back to that. Now, simple mathematics says that if we were to have that happen, we'd have something in the order of 1,500 members of the House of Representatives. That's unwieldy. Well, not really, because let's have them stay home. They can communicate with each other through the internet. They can do it privately. They can do it publicly. They can vote. They can see documents and all the rest. But it'd be very difficult for lobbyists to go all the way around the country and twist the arms of 1,500 different people, and it would be an awful lot more local. And today, I regret to say, a lot of our members of Congress really should be like NASCAR drivers and should have their sponsors written in patches on their suits, because money controls much too much. Under this circumstance, money wouldn't control as much, and there's nothing in the Constitution that says there have to be 435 members of Congress. That's statutory. So would you vote for my bill to have, in effect, about 30,000 per representative?
Interesting story about that. So my favorite story from the convention, if you go to the National Archives or download the high resolution scan that you can download on the page 1 of the Constitution, about 8 lines down from the beginning, it says that the House of Representatives shall be consistent of one representative per 30,000 people. But if you look at it, it's like smudged in there, because on the morning of September 17th, 1787, they were reviewing the text as written by Jacob Showles against the text they had given him. But at that time, George Washington kind of spoke up, and he said one of the only substantive things that he said for the whole convention, which it used to say 40. It said 1 representative per 40,000. And he said, I think that the representatives need to be closer to the people. And because it was George Washington, they all went, all right. And they just, and like got the, and then changed it to 30. And then the actual original First Amendment. So Madison produced a draft of 12 amendments, which today our First Amendment was his Third Amendment. His Second Amendment was our 27th Amendment. It's a long story. His First Amendment was actually about representation. It said that you would have 1 representative per 30,000, then 40,000, and then 50,000 up to 100 people, and then 200. I can't remember the exact thing, but it shall never exceed 1 representative per 100,000. It had like an increasing realm of representation. Now, Judge Gray, in terms of whether or not I endorse it, it's an interesting question. I think that you have collective action problems that emerge from legislators that are that numerous, which actually can empower those who can sort of reach out and like kind of different organizations that can wield influence in caucuses together. I'm not sure. What I want to look at is whether or not the New Hampshire legislator is, which would be the closest thing that we have to this. It's wildly representative. It's like this immediate 12 houses have a member of the New Hampshire State House, right? Whether or not it's more immune. This would be a political science question. But I do think it's an important point. The representation of the people was the core of this, right? This is the core idea. As I said at the beginning, in the theory that they operate under, it was the legitimating thing for taxation, it was the legitimating thing for all laws that acted directly on the American people, right? And so what we have today, and what they would never have predicted, the thing that the framers never would have predicted, is that Congress would have given away its power. They would not jealously guard its power, but freely give it to the executive, and that we would not have what I would call representative government anymore. So we don't even have it now, because we've destroyed structural protections that said that the first and most important branch of government is the representative body of Congress, and that produces the laws, and the executive executes laws. Now we have the executive doing almost all the work.
For example,
all the framers would be astounded. Sorry?
The declaration of war has been abrogated to the president.
So now all the framers, it doesn't even matter what part of the spectrum you'd be on. From Luther Martin, like mentioned by Joellen, like who stayed around in the convention but didn't sign the document, to Alexander Hamilton, who I will call a monarchist because I think he was, to James Madison, like all of them would agree on this point. what we have today is nothing like any of them would have envisioned within a popularity. And the president that we have is more powerful than the king that we overthrew.
Well, when Gouverneur Morris, near the end of the convention, produced the final draft, he added the words, "We the people." There was no debate about it. That's really, they wanted it for the people. And Jim, when you talk about the number, the 30,000, that was debated in Massachusetts and Virginia. And they so wanted the representatives to be responsive to the people. They were concerned that being elected for 2 years was too long. They should be elected annually so that if they didn't like what they were doing, they could be removed right away. And we have not only gotten far away from that principle, but we've almost gotten away from time on our program here. So Jim, you want to close out? And I think on behalf of all of us, I want to thank Trevor. This has been fascinating. And I know our audience is going to learn a lot from this.
Really, I want to add in one sneak question first, Trevor. The full name of this show that you have benefited us by with your presence is Becoming America. America is a perfect idea. The United States of America is a work in progress. I believe that our country is better today than it was 10 years ago or 40 years ago. And I'm hopeful that it will be better 10 years from now. What are your thoughts? And I'll give you about a minute.
The short answer is I think that libertarian-minded people like me and like you, I know, we spend a lot of time griping about government and the size and scope, and we should. But we the defeat of slavery, women's rights, gay marriage, marijuana legalization, these things are important, and many of these things, Americans end up doing the right thing. We also end up, trying to rob Peter to pay Paul, but we are in many ways more free now, and for some people 100% more free now than they were at the time 100 years ago or 200 years ago.
Yes, indeed. Well, again, we could go on, and maybe in some ways we have, but the importance of liberty we can talk about. It's the fundamental for our country, what set us aside from other countries. But we'll go along with this. We have another 14 sessions. Please join us. And by the way, if you'd like to hear all of the songs of convention, not only Overthrow the Government, it's not cheating. You can go to my website. It's judgejimgray.com and listen to all of the songs if you wish. Also, if you'd like to learn more about the whole situation, you can go to where are we? Concordia University, Irvine Center for Public Policy on the internet and learn a lot about that. Certainly to Cato as well. And next time to our audience, we're going to join with a new guest, Dr. William Bradley Allen, a political science professor, author, and former chairman, by the way, of the United States Commission on Civil Rights. So please join us. Tell your friends. We're trying to inspire, have a little fun along the way, and learn. We learn from each other about our country. We are in development. We certainly were founded by some people with flaws. We still are run with people with flaws, but I believe that we are getting better. Finally, it's our government, and if it's not working, we have no one to blame but ourselves. So take it upon yourself to assist us become America. Thank you. We'll see you again next time. Again, Professor Burrus, Attorney Burrus, Mr. Burrus, Trevor, thank you for being with us. And again, thanks to my co-host, the professor and the American. We'll see you next time.